I have that month and go maybe, say, to New York and get myself a job and find out what life's all about on my own.
What if we told you that some of Hollywood's most beloved legends, those glamorous faces from the golden age, hid deeply racist beliefs behind the spotlight?
It was that underpinning that made what he did so effective, because there was a gentle and real core of sensitivity to the man.
From open support for white supremacy to blackface performances to mocking entire cultures on screen, these 15 stars weren't just icons. They were part of a system built on exclusion and harmful stereotypes. They smiled for the cameras, but stayed silent, or worse, when it truly mattered. Stick around, because what you're about to hear isn't taught in film school. This is the dark, uncomfortable truth about the stars we thought we knew. John Wayne, the Western icon with white supremacist views. John Wayne wasn't just a cowboy on screen. He was the cowboy, the symbol of American ruggedness. But behind the swagger and slow drawl was a deeply controversial man with views that shocked even his supporters. In a 1971 Playboy interview, Wayne openly stated that he believed in white supremacy, at least until, as he put it, Black Americans were responsible enough. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was said with conviction, and it pulled the curtain back on the man behind the myth. He also defended the brutal colonization of Native American land, saying it was justified because Native tribes were selfishly trying to keep it for themselves. And when you look at Wayne's filmography, the pattern becomes clearer. Native Americans were often cast as savages. Black and Hispanic characters, if included at all, were often one-dimensional or ridiculed. Decades later, statues and buildings bearing his name still spark protests and public debate. Was he a man of his time, or a man who helped shape the worst parts of it? That question still divides fans and critics. But one thing is certain: the racism wasn't just in the roles. It came straight from the man himself. And he wasn't the only old Hollywood legend hiding behind the screen. Next, we move from the deserts of Wayne's West to the upscale apartments of Breakfast at Tiffany's, where Mickey Rooney delivered one of the most infamous performances in Hollywood's racist legacy. Mickey Rooney, the comedic actor's infamous yellow face. Mickey Rooney was a master of comedic timing and a staple of classic Hollywood. But his performance in Breakfast at Tiffany's as Mr. Yunyoshi has aged like spoiled milk. In the film, Rooney played an Asian landlord, complete with buck teeth, slanted eyes, exaggerated speech, and a cartoonishly heavy accent. What was supposed to be funny came off as grotesquely offensive. And even at the time, many knew it was wrong. But Rooney defended the role for decades. He claimed it was all in good fun and seemed genuinely surprised when Asian Americans and critics called it out for what it was: racist mockery. What made it worse was how central the character was in the film. Every time he appeared, it was a punchline at the expense of a real culture and real people. For generations of Asian viewers, Mr. Yunyoshi became a painful example of how Hollywood viewed them, not as people, but as props. And Rooney's refusal to acknowledge the damage only cemented the role's legacy in shame. What makes this portrayal stand out isn't just how offensive it was, but how long it was celebrated. As we turn from loud mockery to quiet silence, our next actor shows that racism doesn't always need to shout to do damage. James Stewart, beloved by millions, may have had more going on behind the curtain than many ever realized. James Stewart, America's nice guy with troubling allegations. James Stewart was Hollywood's everyman, the soft-spoken, principled hero you could trust. But while he charmed audiences on screen, accounts from biographers and insiders suggest that his off-screen beliefs may not have matched his wholesome image. Though there's no explosive moment like an infamous interview or offensive performance, there's a consistent murmur beneath the surface. Stewart reportedly held discomfort toward the civil rights movement and was hesitant to work with black actors in significant roles. His public silence on racial issues during a time of great upheaval, when voices like his mattered most, speaks volumes. He never used his considerable influence to support integration or racial justice, even as his peers marched and spoke out. In Hollywood, where every choice can be political, Stewart's inaction became a quiet form of resistance to change. And that silence helped maintain the status quo. It's a difficult legacy to reconcile. How do you weigh a man's on-screen warmth with whispers of off-screen prejudice? That tension defines Stewart's place in history. A beloved face who may have stood on the wrong side when it counted most. But not every star kept quiet. Our next figure once marched for civil rights, only to later lead a very different movement. Charlton Heston's story is one of the most dramatic ideological turns in Hollywood history. Charlton Heston, from civil rights ally to cultural conservative. Charlton Heston's career is as grand as the epics he starred in. He played Moses, Ben-Hur, and a host of larger-than-life heroes. But off-screen, his journey from progressive ally to conservative icon is one of old Hollywood's most complex and controversial shifts. In the early 1960s, Heston stood beside Martin Luther King Jr. during the March on Washington. He publicly denounced segregation and lent his voice to civil rights. But in later years, something changed. Heston became a leading figure in the conservative movement, particularly as the president of the NRA. His speeches began to echo the fears of white America, warning of cultural decay and criticizing affirmative action. To many, Heston's transformation felt like a betrayal. A man who once marched for equality now used his platform to oppose the very progress he once supported. His language became coded, with many interpreting it as racially charged. He became a symbol not just of gun rights, but of resistance to multiculturalism and diversity initiatives. Was it political evolution, or a retreat into privilege? That question defines the second half of his legacy. And while he never made overtly racist remarks, his shift in tone and alignment spoke volumes. From a man who changed his stance to one who dodged taking one entirely. Our next subject is Steve McQueen, the anti-hero whose actions reveal a troubling side of his rebel image. Steve McQueen, the anti-hero with a questionable stance. Steve McQueen had the look, the edge, and the effortless cool that made him a symbol of 1960s rebellion. He wasn't just the king of cool. He was the embodiment of the counterculture, a man who rode motorcycles, broke rules, and lived on his own terms. But when it came to the civil rights movement, McQueen's rebellion stopped short. In 1963, Paul Newman invited him to the March on Washington. McQueen refused. While others in Hollywood risked backlash to stand with Dr. King, McQueen stayed silent. That decision may not have made headlines then, but it speaks loudly today. He was also known to associate with figures who held racist views, and some insiders claim he resisted roles that elevated or humanized black characters. He wasn't vocal in his opposition, but his actions, or lack thereof, painted a troubling picture. McQueen built a persona on doing what others wouldn't, but when it came to standing up for justice, he did what too many did: nothing. And in the context of history, that silence becomes complicity. Up next, we examine a man who didn't stay silent. He sang and performed in blackface, becoming famous for a role that still sparks debate. Let's talk about Al Jolson. Al Jolson, the contradiction in blackface. Al Jolson was one of the most influential entertainers of the early 20th century. He helped bring sound to cinema with The Jazz Singer, a groundbreaking film that also cemented a deeply controversial legacy. Because in that film, Jolson appeared in full blackface, singing spirituals and acting out caricatures of African Americans that would define his career. To audiences at the time, it was electrifying. To modern eyes, it's jarring. Jolson wasn't the first to use blackface, but he brought it into the mainstream and made it profitable. His entire act was built on mimicking the voices and expressions of black culture, all while wearing dark makeup and exaggerated features. And yet, this is where his legacy becomes complex. Behind the scenes, Jolson was known for supporting black performers. He used his influence to get them hired, to help desegregate performance venues, and even to challenge the racist norms of vaudeville. He wasn't a behind-closed-doors bigot. He truly admired the music and spirit of the people he imitated. But admiration isn't the same as respect. His performances still traded in mockery. They still reinforced stereotypes. And his fame helped normalize blackface in an era that should have been moving past it. Jolson may have believed he was helping, but in doing so, he made minstrelsy palatable for the masses. That contradiction, being an ally in private and a symbol of racism in public, is why Jolson remains one of Hollywood's most debated figures. He reminds us that intent doesn't erase impact. But while Jolson wore blackface for dramatic effect, another screen legend would do it for Shakespeare and defend it for decades. Let's turn to Laurence Olivier and the performance that cast a shadow over his towering career. Laurence Olivier, the esteemed actor in blackface. Laurence Olivier is often hailed as one of the greatest actors to ever grace stage or screen. His Shakespearean performances are still studied today, but one of his most ambitious roles, playing Othello, would later be remembered not for its brilliance, but for its blatant racism. In the 1965 film adaptation of Othello, Olivier wore full blackface, not just makeup, but a complete transformation. Painted skin, widened lips, and a deliberately exaggerated accent. At the time, the performance was praised. He was even nominated for an Academy Award. But today, it's one of the clearest examples of how far Hollywood and the theater world was willing to go to exclude actors of color. Olivier defended his choices. He claimed it was in service of the role, that Shakespeare's Moor needed a visual distinction. But the problem wasn't just the makeup, it was the mimicry, the gestures, the voice. It reduced a complex, tragic character into a racial spectacle. And in doing so, it robbed countless black actors of the chance to portray one of the few major classical roles written for them. It wasn't that there were no talented black actors at the time. There were many. But Olivier's prestige and star power meant the industry didn't even consider them. And when the backlash came, he stood by the performance, refusing to admit any wrongdoing. For decades, this version of Othello was held up as the standard. Today, it's a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most acclaimed actors can be blind to the harm they cause. But while Olivier defended his portrayal as artistic, our next star took problematic roles early in his career, only to become a passionate activist later in life. Marlon Brando's path was one of contradictions. Marlon Brando, activist with a problematic past. Marlon Brando is remembered as a revolutionary, the man who changed acting forever with raw emotion and unpredictable intensity. He famously turned down his Oscar for The Godfather, sending a Native American activist in his place to protest Hollywood's treatment of indigenous people. That moment made headlines and made Brando a hero to many. But his early career tells a more complicated story. In Viva Zapata, Brando portrayed Mexican revolutionary Emiliano Zapata. Despite being a white actor from Nebraska, he wore brown face for the role, adopting a heavy accent and stylized mannerisms that were far from authentic. Later, he would also play an Asian character in The Tea House of the August Moon, again using makeup and stereotypical gestures. These roles, while praised at the time, reinforced Hollywood's tradition of excluding actors of color, even from roles written about them. Brando, to his credit, would later speak out against this. He called out casting discrimination and became a vocal supporter of civil rights, even marching with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So how do we reconcile these two Brandos? the young man who embodied racial caricatures for a paycheck, and the older man who risked his career to speak out for justice? The answer lies in Hollywood's evolution and in Brando's willingness to evolve with it. He may not have started as a voice for change, but he became one. And in an industry where many stayed silent, that matters. Next, we move to another actor whose transformation was less personal and more imposed by casting directors. Natalie Wood's most famous role is Beloved, but it's also a glaring example of whitewashing. Natalie Wood, the whitewashed. Maria. Natalie Wood had the kind of beauty and charm that made her a natural for Hollywood's golden screen. She starred in classics like Rebel Without a Cause and Splendor in the Grass. But her most iconic role came in West Side Story, as Maria, a young Puerto Rican girl caught in a tragic love story. The problem? Wood was of Russian descent, not Latina. To make her look the part, makeup artists darkened her skin and added an accent. No Puerto Rican actresses were seriously considered for the lead, despite the film being centered on their culture and community. Wood did her best with the role, but the casting itself sent a message. Hollywood didn't trust Latina actresses to carry a major film. They wanted a familiar face, someone safe for white audiences, even if it meant altering her identity to fit a stereotype. This wasn't just about Natalie Wood. It was about an entire industry shutting out authentic voices. The film won 10 Oscars and is still celebrated today. But it also stands as a textbook case of whitewashing, a reminder that talent often came second to optics in old Hollywood. Even as the industry praised itself for telling diverse stories, it erased the very people those stories belonged to. That kind of contradiction runs deep, and it didn't stop there. Next up, a comedy legend whose performances crossed the line from clever to cruel. Let's talk about Peter Sellers. Peter Sellers, comedy that mocked cultures. Peter Sellers was a genius at playing characters. From Inspector Clouseau to Dr. Strangelove, he could shift accents, mannerisms, and moods in a blink. But not every performance aged well, especially when it came to race. In the 1968 film, The Party, Sellers played Prundi Vai Bakshi, an Indian character. He wore brown face, adopted a thick accent, and turned cultural traits into punchlines. The film was a commercial success, but the portrayal was cringeworthy even back then. This wasn't an isolated incident. Sellers often played characters from other races and regions, using exaggerated speech and outdated stereotypes for comedic effect. He was praised for his range, but rarely questioned for his insensitivity. Audiences laughed. Critics applauded. But Indian viewers and others from marginalized communities saw something very different. A caricature that reinforced how the West viewed them. Silly, exaggerated, and never taken seriously. Sellers wasn't trying to hurt anyone, but that's the point. In old Hollywood, mocking other cultures was just business as usual, and no one thought twice, because the people being mocked rarely had a seat at the table to object. Peter Sellers was brilliant, but brilliance doesn't excuse blindness. His comedy, like much of Hollywood's past, came at someone else's expense. Bing Crosby, crooner in blackface. Bing Crosby had the smoothest voice in Hollywood. He was the warm, comforting face of post-war America, beloved for classics like White Christmas and Going My Way. But beneath the wholesome image was a man who, like many of his peers, participated in one of the ugliest traditions of early showbiz, blackface. In the 1942 film Holiday Inn, Crosby performed a musical number in full blackface, complete with minstrel show styling. The scene was festive on the surface, but rooted in caricature. The lyrics, costuming, and choreography all mocked African American culture under the guise of celebration. It wasn't a side gag. It was center stage. To many audiences at the time, it was normal. But to today's viewers, and especially black viewers even then, it was dehumanizing. And what's more telling, is that this wasn't just a one-time event for Crosby. Like many stars of the era, he performed in minstrel-style routines on radio and stage, using them for laughs and applause. What's chilling is how comfortably these routines were accepted, and how someone as squeaky clean as Crosby could participate without pushback. He wasn't seen as radical or offensive. He was seen as safe. That's the danger. When racism becomes so normalized, it hides in plain sight. As we leave Crosby's crooning behind, we move to someone whose stardom began even earlier, at an age when most kids were learning to read. Judy Garland's talent was undeniable, but her early roles revealed just how deeply racism was woven into the studio system, even for child stars. Judy Garland, a star's early brush with blackface. Before Judy Garland was a legend, she was a studio-controlled child. MGM molded her into America's sweetheart, complete with ruby slippers and tearful songs. But in one of her earliest roles, she was asked to perform in full blackface, and she did, because she had no choice. In the 1938 film Everybody Sing, Garland plays a young girl who's misunderstood until she belts out a jazzy number in blackface, mimicking stereotypical African-American mannerisms and dialect. It's meant to be funny, even endearing, but it's painful to watch today. She was just 16. The fault doesn't lie with her. It lies with the system that thought it was acceptable to turn black identity into a child's costume. It reflects how even the most innocent images of classic Hollywood carried dark undertones. Garland would later become a vocal supporter of civil rights. She performed at rallies and refused to perform at segregated venues. But her blackface performance remains a mark on her otherwise luminous legacy. A reminder that the industry didn't spare anyone from complicity, not even its most cherished stars. And Judy wasn't alone. Another Hollywood legend, known for grace and rhythm, would perform a tribute that turned into a controversy of its own. Let's talk about Fred Astaire. Fred Astaire, the legendary dancer's misstep. Fred Astaire's name is almost synonymous with elegance. His dancing, his charm, and his effortless style became a blueprint for generations of performers. But even icons can stumble, and Astaire's blackface number in Swing Time remains one of the most uncomfortable moments in his otherwise glittering career. In that 1936 film, Astaire performs a tap routine as a tribute to Bill Bojangles Robinson, the legendary black tap dancer. But instead of simply honoring him through dance, Astaire dons blackface and mimics the very minstrel traditions Robinson spent his life rising above. What complicates things is intent. Astaire was reportedly a fan of Robinson. The dance itself was technically brilliant, but the choice to wear blackface overshadowed the performance. It turned tribute into imitation, and imitation into mockery. Astaire never apologized for the number, and while it was celebrated at the time, modern audiences have re-evaluated it for what it truly was. Another example of how racism was woven into entertainment's very foundation. This wasn't an outlier. It was Hollywood standard. And even the best performers weren't exempt from the worst traditions, but not all racism was displayed on stage. Sometimes, it lingered in whispers, behind closed doors. Our next star projected a heroic image, but his off-camera behavior raises serious questions. Enter Clark Gable. Clark Gable, progressive on set, prejudiced off. Clark Gable was Hollywood royalty, the king of the silver screen. Women swooned, men admired him, and in some circles, he was even praised for taking a stand. He famously walked off the set of Gone with the Wind after discovering segregated restrooms for black cast and crew. That moment became legend, but was it the full story? While Gable's on-set stance was commendable, reports from colleagues and biographers suggest a more complicated picture. In private, Gable was known to use racial slurs. He socialized in elite circles that embraced exclusion and prejudice, and he rarely aligned himself with progressive causes, unless they were convenient. Even Gone with the Wind His most iconic film has aged into one of Hollywood's most racially charged epics. The glorification of the Old South, the happy slave tropes, it's all there, with Gable front and center. While he didn't write the script, he benefited from its messaging and never publicly challenged it. Was Gable a quiet ally or a man of convenience? His silence on major civil rights issues in later years suggests the latter. In the end, Gable's duality reflects an industry and a society trying to have it both ways. Our final figure didn't wear blackface or star in racially charged epics, but her silence said everything. Katharine Hepburn, Hollywood's boldest woman, was strikingly quiet when it came to race. Katharine Hepburn, a legacy of silence. Katharine Hepburn was a powerhouse, a trailblazer for women in film, a champion for independence, intelligence, and career ambition. She shattered gender norms and wore trousers long before it was acceptable. But for all her boldness, Hepburn had a blind spot, and that blind spot was race. While she was vocal on women's rights, Hepburn never spoke publicly in support of civil rights. She remained silent during the movement's most pivotal years, even as peers like Marlon Brando and Harry Belafonte used their platforms for change. She also starred in films that featured whitewashed casts and outdated racial portrayals. Even in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, a film seen as progressive for its time, Hepburn's performance was within a script that softened the edges of racial tension to make it palatable for white audiences. Silence doesn't always mean agreement, but in a time when voices were needed, hers was absent. And for someone as outspoken and influential as Hepburn, that silence carried weight. In the end, her legacy is one of strength, style, and grit, but also of selective advocacy. And that's the story of so many stars from Hollywood's golden age. Legends, yes, but not without shadows.